Sometimes to start a conversation of inclusion,
we have to acknowledge who has been previously excluded.
Whether you were the one being exclusive or not.
Acknowledge its existence.
Don't feel guilty, feel a responsibility.
Not responsible for what was done then,
but responsible for what can be done now.
I am different.
I am different.
I am different.
I am different.
That doesn't mean my voice can be dismissed.
My voice matters.
Ask me about myself.
Not my group, not who I represent.
But me.
Because that is all I know how to be.
If you want to know me.
Don't assume or presume anything.
Hear my stories, and I can hear yours.
Because a humanity whole means a humanity heard.
Every face, every culture.
Every race.
Every color.
Every code.
Every soul.
Together.
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 We make the earth whole.
I am part of this conversation.
I am a part of this conversation.
I am a part of this conversation.
And you are too.
These stories are ours. So please,
Please.
Hold a space for us to be.
It is hard enough to share a painful experience which I have lived.
It will be far more difficult
to also try to convince you it happened.
Please, don't make us do that.
Listen and receive us.
Seek to understand.
We welcome you to the conversation.
We welcome you to the conversation.
Мы приветствуем вас в разговоре.
Bem-vindo à conversa.
We welcome you to this conversation.
We welcome you to the conversation. We welcome you to the conversation.
te damos la bienvenida a la conversación.
We welcome you to the conversation.
I can't believe we have these type of people in our school.
Call me a redskin.
Oh, that's another black kid.
It's to a word.
What are you? Savage.
You're intimidated. The black guy's better.
Can't speak Spanish.
Like a dirty Indian.
Afraid to approach you. And grandma and mom answer looking at me weird.
But where does it come from? Dr. Jessica Taylor, the Director of Cultural Integration at Multnomah University, discusses with us bias and prejudice and their effects.
Each and every one of us holds bias. We use bias all day long in all of our interactions and relationships. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but normally when we're exercising it towards the negative bent. And that's when it becomes a problem in our relationships and in our community. The prejudice is very similar, but prejudice definitely negatively prejudges a person or a situation. Actually, when you look at the law in our country, when something is done with prejudice, what it means is that it causes harm, undue harm to a certain person or group. So prejudice is different than bias. It is almost always going to be a negative prejudice towards someone or something, and it causes harm to a person or group.
What do you think about the term reverse racism?
That's a great question. So I understand, first of all, that people feel like they're being targeted. I understand why people feel like there's something called reverse racism. But when you look at the actual term, and racism, again, is a belief that there's a superiority and an inferiority in people innately because of their race. But it is also, again, dependent upon systems. So systems of power are what makes racism impossible for a person of color to exercise against a white person. The reason for that is because they can be biased and they can be prejudiced, but the system of power does not support that bias and prejudice. It does not have the same negative effects that it would have when it's happening as we're traditionally talking about it. When you look at bias and prejudice, they don't become racism until they're working in a racist system. That's what gives them the power. So again, I can say I don't like someone, but I don't have any power over them structurally. But when I don't like someone and I have the power to hire them or fire them or choose where they live or choose the legislation that passes in their district or doesn't, that's where the racism becomes systemic, institutional.
But what builds the system? We spoke with Student Body President Raquel Polanco about what behaviors support the systemic discrimination.
It's built on exclusion, it's built on murder, it's built on violence. And in order to maintain this groupthink, essentially, in order to maintain this community, that violence has to be repeated. And a lot of how it plays out is really systemic and inherent and subtle in institutions. It's not like people actually going out and murdering each other, even though sometimes that happens. But a lot of times it's in the psyche, and it's making someone believe that you cannot gain power. There's a theorist, but he talks about how the colonizing of the psyche, and that's kind of how disempowerment works. It's when someone can get in your head and say, you can't accomplish, you can't believe, you can't achieve. When a lot of the slaves were released, a lot of them were like, well, we can't there's like, how are we don't even believe like we can dream.
Raquel then goes on to explain how community is created when one is excluded.
Essentially what unifies a people is the scapegoating of another person, but what helps bring people together or make people feel as though we are unified or have a common vision or a common goal is to say that we also have a common enemy. When I was a little girl, birds used to crash in my window all the time, and I would like get a box and like save them and like get leaves and try to like bring them back to life. And the birds wouldn't always live. Sometimes they would, and they fly around the house, my mom would be livid. But other times they would die, and it would be so sad. And my mom, like, she would look at me like, why are you bringing this bird in? And the thing is that in those moments, like when that bird dies, you don't blame the bird. You blame the person who brought the bird in and created an unsuitable environment for the bird to thrive and survive in. And that's the problem with scapegoat mechanism inherently, is that we bring students into this community of Multnomah, whether it is athletes, students of color, women of color or not, and don't create an environment in which our faculty looks like that, or our staff always looks like that, or the sermons at chapel are to this audience. And then we question why they die, and it's not the bird's fault. It's that we didn't create an environment that was suitable.
But what about sexism, ableism, ageism, classism? Doesn't inequality exist everywhere?
That we have. These structures really affect all parts of our society and how we live as a community. So when you look at superiority and inferiority, that's where you get the oppressor complex, where you get people that are saying, because of this reason, whatever it is, gender, race, social class, I am better than the people who are of a different gender, race, or social class. And so the difference again is in the structure, in the power structure. When you think about women's suffrage, women were not able to grant themselves the right to vote. Men had to come alongside and say there's an inequality and a need for us to correct that. Then it was corrected. The same thing. Slaves were not able to overthrow the structure of slavery in a way that gained them their freedom. White people, or the superior race in the system, had to come about and say that they were not inferior anymore. And so that's the power differential that we're talking about when we talk about correcting these things. The system of power has to be spoken to, or change can't effectively happen systemically.
But why do I need to join the conversation?
Oftentimes people will say things like, I'm not racist, or I don't have a racist bone in my body, or I'm married to a person of color, or I have mixed race children. And they feel like that actually excludes them from the conversation with racism. And I would challenge that, thinking that racism is not just an individual act. It's also not binary, where you have a good person and a bad person, and only bad people are racist. Good people are still functioning under the concept of racism. They're still influenced by it. They still are breathing that air. And so we can't, any of us, no matter how much we're inundated with this topic, stop fighting to understand where our own bias and prejudice is turning into something that oppresses other people.
But what does this feel like? We turn to Zach and Adriana, current students at Multnomah University, for their personal experience and if they thought change was possible.
I think the worst part about it is it's like feeling an outcast. Especially when I go to my mom's side, like I'm the only black, or I'm the only person there with a black like skin color, or like black heritage, or something like that. So you can always feel like you're out of place. If you think about habits that we have in like our daily lives, like we wake up, we brush our teeth, we wash our face, that type of stuff, we can always change those. And I feel like with bias, like, and all that type of stuff, you can change it. In that case, it's a whole thing of just swallowing your pride. Because if you can change, but you have to like be able to like recognize that like you're wrong. And like it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to like, make a judgment. Okay, I shouldn't have made that judgment. And like we do that every day. I do that every day.
So how can non-people of color help? I spoke to Christy Martin, a student success counselor at Multnomah University, about the role of white people in this conversation.
If I as a white person don't make race my issue, and by making it my issue I mean learning about it, taking the time to have an opinion about it, processing it, learning about it some more, learning about it some more, learning about it some more, and engaging it. If I don't make it my issue in those ways, then I perpetuate the system and I do nothing to disrupt the system. When I realized that bias and prejudice is a natural occurrence, that gave me a lot more freedom, I felt like, to engage even the conversation on race and diversity and different things.
Because if you see it popping up, then you don't have to label yourself as the scary outlier evil person who had this thought. It's, oh, okay, we experience these things, it's normal, now let's address it.
That like ignoring it is not going to solve anything, that we have to talk about stuff like this, stuff that people don't want to talk about, and we have to confront issues like this, because ignoring them and sweeping all those differences under the rug like isn't going to do anything or solve anything.
Yeah. People see color and just see like the beauty in the color, and not focus so much on like the actual color of the skin, but focus on like the person that they are and like what they represent and who they are. I feel like I should tell you like I'm this, and then obviously right when I tell you that, the human brain is just gonna make an assumption off of that. And there's nothing that like can control that. That's just gonna happen. Figure out who I am first, not like what I am.